Good evening and welcome. My name is Erin Lurie, and I'm the head of adult audiences at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens. We are so thrilled to have you joining us this evening for the second lecture in our Great Homes and Gardens series. We will get started in just a few moments. We're waiting as more folks are joining the program right now. Welcome all. We will be getting started in just a few moments. All right. At this point, I'd like to invite Hillwood's director, Kate Markert, to come on and introduce this evening's program.
Thank you so much, Erin. Good evening. I'm Kate Markert, Executive Director at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens in Washington, D.C. My pronouns are she and her. Thank you for inviting us into your homes this evening. As we begin, I would like to take a moment to gratefully acknowledge the Nacotch tank, also documented as the Anacostan, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey, the native peoples on whose ancestral lands Hillwood stands, as well as the diverse and vibrant native communities who make their homes near us today. With springtime hovering, as you can see right behind me, right around us, and a new exhibition opening this Saturday, it is a fabulous time to visit Hillwood. The luxury of clay, porcelain past and present, will be on view until June 26th. Those of you who are Hillwood members are invited to preview this beautiful and fascinating show the rest of this week. Tomorrow we're open 10 to 7, and on Friday we're open 10 to 5. Please remember to bring your proof of vaccination, as Hillwood still requires it for visitors over the age of 12. I also hope you'll join us for the exhibition Benefit Through the Fire, which will take place in person on Wednesday, March 16th at Hillwood. We are so excited about having an actual event on campus next month. With the sunset falling a little later each night, we're looking forward to welcoming the spring with a wonderfully robust calendar of virtual events. We continue our Great Homes and Gardens series next Wednesday, February 27th, with Jane S. Day, the author of From Palm Beach to Shangri-La, The Architecture of Marion Sims Wyeth. The following Wednesday, March 2nd, nationally acclaimed interior designer Corey Damon Jenkins focuses on bold, innovative design techniques to end our series. March is a time for celebrations. Next month, we celebrate Hillwood founder Marjorie Merriweather Post's favorite flower, the orchid. Join us virtually all month long for orchid care tips, greenhouse tours, and repotting demonstrations. March 15th is Marjorie Post's birthday, and if you're on campus that day, you will find a beautiful arrangement on her obelisk in the Rose Garden to commemorate it. Later in March, we dive into the luxury of clay. On Wednesday, March 23rd, artist, social activist, and educator Roberto Lugo joins Hillwood's curator, Rebecca Tillis, for a virtual conversation exploring the significance behind his ceramic works. We'll gather in person, and there will be a virtual option as well, on Wednesday, April 2nd, for Rebecca Tillis's talk about the porcelain collections of Consuelo Vanderbilt, Anna Thompson Dodge, and Hillwood's own Marjorie Merriweather Post. And finally, on April 21st, contemporary artist Chris Anteman will give a virtual artist talk from her home on the West Coast about her intricate ceramic work inspired by 18th century porcelain figures. I know many of our members are joining us today, and you will all benefit from this spring's events. And if you're not already a member, I highly encourage you to join and support Hillwood's ongoing programming. You can learn more about upcoming programs and register at hillwoodmuseum.org. I want to now share a few practical reminders about how tonight's virtual lecture will work. Your cameras and microphones are off, so please make yourself comfortable. We still want to hear from you. Please say hello and tell us where you are viewing from using the chat. And finally, submit your questions via the Q&A module, which is separate, of course, from the chat, as they cross your mind. We will get to as many questions as we can at the end of the program. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Carolyn Mullet. She's a retired, award-winning garden designer who practiced in Washington, D.C. metro area for over 30 years. She received her formal training in residential landscape design from George Washington University. Carolyn is also owner and creative director of Terrace Tours, which offers international garden tours each year for the discerning garden traveler. Carolyn's book, Adventures in Eden, an intimate tour of private European gardens, was published by Timber Press in 2020. It's available in our museum shop. In addition, she produces popular social media posts daily, showcasing gardens from around the world on both Instagram and Facebook for a large international community of garden and plant enthusiasts. Carolyn, we are delighted to have you.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight, and thank you, Kate, for that lovely introduction. Tonight, we're going to talk about my favorite topic, which is gardens, and in particular, the gardens that I profiled in my book, Adventures in Eden. In the early part of the 21st century, right now, some of us that are in the garden world suspect that we are in a golden age of garden making. This idea that our current century is a very remarkable garden era is based on the flurry of activity in garden construction and planting design, seen most clearly in Western Europe, and particularly in private gardens owned and managed by individuals, as opposed to public gardens owned and operated by organizations. And that is what Adventures in Eden is about. 50 private gardens, each made or significantly updated in our current century. And there's one more thing. I chose gardens that open to visitors at some point each year, and some are open every weekend, spring through early autumn. There are 3 types of garden makers that I include in my book. And I didn't quite realize this until the end, after I'd selected all the gardens. And some of them are being built by talented garden owners with no formal training, such as this one in Italy. Others are by professional designers hired by the owners, such as this one in Spain. And others are professionals who have made their own gardens, like this one in Germany. Before we begin with the slideshow, there are 2 things that you'll notice in many of the gardens we're going to see that are not common in the United States. And so I thought I'd bring it up at the beginning rather than dealing with it maybe at the end in the questions. The first is that many of these gardens have shaped plants, better known as topiary, or I sometimes think of them as green sculptures. It's been a part of the gardening culture in Europe for hundreds of years. So as I always tell my tour groups, and I'm telling you now, let's be generous and not necessarily look at them in the way that we would in our own gardens. And let's try to accept that this is something that is meaningful to them and a part of their background, their history, something that they've seen throughout their lives. The second thing is that there is a theme that's kind of developed in the last 10 years, maybe even 20 years, in many of the gardens that I see in Europe. And it is the theme of wildness. And you may ask what that is. I think you'll understand better at the end of this evening. But it is a kind of gardening that accepts things that are not necessarily as manicured as you may be used to. And sometimes it feels a bit overwhelming to us when we look at it. We are just not used to that kind of looseness. But the idea comes from a good place. It comes out of a concern for our planet and the environment and global warming. It comes from a desire to use fewer resources to maintain our gardens. It comes from wanting to use natives more often in our gardens. And it also is a way of accommodating wildlife into our gardens. So I just thought I'd give you a heads up that you're going to see some of this. And your first reaction may be, they should take care of that. But they are taking care of it. And so you have to kind of go with their flow in this. So let's begin looking at gardens, and we'll first look at professionally made gardens. And I've decided to use 3 gardens in England that were professionally made because they kind of represent types that you're likely to see if you go to Europe to see private gardens. So the first one is Nornie Woods. It is a garden that is in Surrey, which is, if you know anything about the counties in England, it's a little west and south, but pretty close to London, actually. And it's a garden that started because Jean and Richard Thompson wanted to have a country home. So they bought this property, renovated the house, and then were ready to deal with the garden. But their garden was, even though they were really very seasoned gardeners, they'd always gardened, they considered themselves competent, they weren't quite sure how to handle the design. And so they hired a company called Acres Wild, which is known for creating country gardens in that area of England. They asked Acres Wild to do something kind of different than Acres Wild generally does. And that is because they were very close to the home of Gertrude Jekyll. And some of you may know, and some may not, that Gertrude Jekyll was a really important character or influence, or an influencer, if you want to use Instagram kind of terminology, in the early 20th century. She was an artist who gradually started working with plants and creating gardens. And her home was maybe 20 minutes away from where Jean and Richard Thompson had purchased their home. And so they had always admired her, and they said they wanted to bring some of that into their gardens. And so Acres Wild ended up making the garden that we're going to see. So first you come into the garden, and there is an entry garden, and that's what's in this picture here, with water, so that you feel it's a small area, and you feel very much like you're retreating from the hectic world, and you're going into some place that's different. It has many, many plants that you are probably familiar with if you're a gardener or if you have your own garden. And so it's in a way a more traditional garden than what you might see in some of the other new gardens that have been built in England or in all of Europe. From the entry garden, you walk down an alley that is a set of trees that are planted in parallel lines, so that the trunks kind of create a rhythm as you look down your path. And on either side, there are perennials and bulbs. And one of the things that they really wanted to use was plants that Gertrude Chico would use, which were roses, geraniums, and allium. But Gertrude Chico used a vast amount of perennials and plants that flower. And because she had something like, now I've forgotten, but I think it was something like 15 gardeners to keep her garden going. Today, we don't have such luxury. And so the Acres Wild studio simplified that and used only 3 or 4 or 5 plants in each planting area. On the other side from the LA, there is a lawn in the middle, and on the other side is a very wide walk made of local stone and leading to a building that you see at the end. In this area, they used catmint or nepeta, roses, and geraniums again. And this is such an English kind of palette of plants. And the colors are pastel, which is something, if you've been to gardens in England, you know that that's a very popular kind of color palette to use. At the end of the path is something called a Thunderhouse. And this is a direct copy of something that Gertrude Chico had in her garden. And it was a building in which she could be sheltered, but enjoy a thunderstorm in. She liked being out. She didn't want to get in the rain or see lightning, but she loved the thunder, being in a little cottage, let's say, or a little garden house. And so they built that as the focal point of this path. Here is a close-up of some of the other garden flowers in the garden. Again, very pretty pastel. But on the other side of the Thunderhouse, the design team has made something that I think is really an important point in making any garden. And that is that you can have very intensely planted areas, but then you also need a place that the eye can rest. And they've created what they call the Tranquility Pool Terrace. And so not many flowers, much cooler in the shade, and it gives you the chance for repose. So this is a garden that I think, is more traditional than some, but it's updated it and made it into a contemporary garden. Our next garden is Broughton Grange, which is again in England, in the county of Oxfordshire. And this is a garden that is open most weekends and had an addition to what was essentially a 19th century garden that the owners wanted to make for the millennium. So in the year 2000, they built this garden, which was some distance away from the house and from the rest of the garden, in a paddock that they decided they wanted to make a walled garden, and they built walls and they terraced. It was on a slope, and you have to walk some distance to get to it. It's not connected to the house like we would normally think of as a garden being. They hired Tom Stewart Smith, who, if you haven't heard of him, You may not ever hear of him again, but he is really one of the top designers in England today and does beautiful, large, complicated country gardens. So what was interesting about this garden is that when you enter it, you see right away that this is going to be a garden about flowers mainly, because that's what you see going down the path. But when you go a little further, there is a pond, which is rectilinear. The whole thing is a rectangle, and then there are rectangular terraces going down. And this is a place where you can pause or where the family can have dinner. And then you go a little further and you go, there is a rill or a stream, a contained straight lined stream that dumps into the pond. And in that area, there is a path that you can walk through. And although the other paths are very, very wide, this is narrow. This is meant for one person to walk through the plantings. And as you can see, the plantings are pretty wild. It's like, it's one of these experiences that you feel immersed in the plantings. And it isn't like being a normal English border, which is something that you look at from the outside. This takes you right into the flowers, and you have to watch where you step because the flowers are falling over the gravel path. So this is called naturalistic planting, and it is something which some people consider wild. Other people could just consider it to be something that just echoes nature, that it's not really wild, that it's still a very composed kind of picture that the designer has made. And as you can see, the one end of the walled garden is open to the countryside beyond. And here are some more of the plantings. Eventually you get to the bottom, and that is where there is a modern parterre. A parterre you may remember from maybe your images that you've seen of French gardens, which is usually a flat garden, a flat terrace that has a pattern made by a lot of times boxwoods, or there are other plants that they use also to make a pattern that is very recognizable. Here, Tom Stewart Smith made a pattern which is not recognizable. What he did is he took leaves from the hedgerows as you approached the garden, the lanes in this area, took some leaves, he blew them up, and then he used the veination of the leaves to make a pattern that he used for the boxwood edging in the garden. And in between those very soft boxwoods, there he put seasonal plantings. Here it is spring, and so there's tulips. In the summer, there will be annuals in there. So just to kind of reinforce the naturalistic planting that we saw a bit back, that I think of it as a planting style that mixes strong perennials with grasses in an artful way to mimic nature. It's informal, it's loose, it's dynamic. It has more to do with like a mountain meadow or a native prairie than a structured garden planting that we may be used to. The next garden is another step in the naturalism trend. And it is a garden called Fairlight End, owned by Chris and Robin Hutt. It is also in southern England, in East Sussex. And this was a couple that had lived in London, and as they were getting toward retirement, decided they wanted a bigger garden and they wanted to move out of London. And so they moved to this area. which is very close to the ocean. And it is an area that is very ancient in terms of the history of England. It's hard to describe exactly where it is, but it's called the Sussex Weald. And their house sits up at the top of a hill and then slopes all the way down. So they wanted to do something that was not typical. They wanted to do something that was of their time, in other words, modern. And they weren't sure how to do it. So they hired Ian Kitson, who is known for making gardens that have really strong curves, that are very curvaceous. Most modern gardens have straight lines, just as in Broughton Grange that we just saw. But this one, they wanted to do curves. And Robin and Chris decided that this was the guy for them. And he decided to do what you could have done with stone, but he wanted to be more modern and to have less impact on the slope. And he used Corten steel. And so this is steel that has been curved into this retaining wall. And on the top, there is lawn. Below is a curvaceous deck where they can sit and look over their property out into the Sussex Weald. So from a bedroom in their house, this is what it looks like. So you can see that their land slopes down and there is a pond at the bottom. So they were very interested in nature. They were very interested in the idea of having a meadow. Chris had this like galvanizing experience many, many years ago. I think he said it was in the 80s when he visited Miriam Rothschild's, of the Rothschild family, but very different from she did things in a different way because she was a naturalist. And she had a garden that was completely wild, which was almost unheard of at that time. And Chris went to see her garden and he said he had never seen so many butterflies and bees in his life. And he's never forgotten it. And he decided he wanted to be able to have a garden like that. So most of the garden at Fairlight End is a meadow. And the ponds for wildlife and the meadows just really bring wildlife into their garden. They are English, so they love topiary, they love shaped plants, but instead of shaping them into maybe geometric forms like you would see in some gardens, they're all of the plants that they shape are in non-geometric, in soft shapes, and they feel like this is both taking from their tradition, but tweaking it and making it more modern. So when I was interviewing the owners, they told me that gradually they have allowed the wildness and the meadows to come closer and closer to the house, so that now although they have some conventional plantings, it is almost up to their deck. And this is the way it looks now. And he said, so where are we going to stop? I don't know. He said, maybe we'll let it come right up to the house. And this is a trend that I think is something that if you go to English gardens and if you see their meadows, you can see that they are gradually taking over more and more of the land, and there is less and less manicured space. So now we're going to look at professionals who are making their own gardens. And the first one is in Belgium. It is by Chris Giesland, and it's in West Flanders, in the north of Belgium. And he is a professional garden designer, but in the course of working as a designer, he has made his own garden, and it's really lovely. You enter and there's very small spaces. The house isn't large. They're lovely little shaped plants. And one of the biggest spaces close to the house is this koi pond, which all it has in it is this bench with the topiary and a huge hedge behind it. But he also is very interested in perennials, which are huge in Europe. I would say there are gardens which took out all their shrubs, all of their other kinds of plants, had very little trees, and instead they put in perennials. Well, Chris is in that trend. He made this double border that has large looping hedges on either side. So it's more playful than some of the serious straight lined borders. But he used modern plants. And what I mean by modern plants is these are plants that don't need staking, they don't need deadheading, and they don't need dividing. So whereas the typical European border had all of those things, it was like you really had to carefully take care of your plants in order to get the perfect picture. This is a kind of planting that is looser and more casual and a little bit more spontaneous. Later, behind the looping hedge, he has a swimming pond, which is a natural swimming pond. It is not, it has no chemicals in it. And he says when he comes home from a day of laying out plants in his customers' gardens, he just dives right in and gets refreshed by this. And at this stage in this garden, it's getting more and more wild. So this is a little bit of a path around the other side of the swimming pond. And, it's letting the woodland come up closer. The plants are not organized in a necessarily, tall, shorter, shortest. So it's all kind of mixed in. But these are plants that you would probably see, you recognize some that could be in gardens around DC. And this is a close-up of a plant that he really loves, and that is Diphelia mimosa. I had never seen it before, and ferns. Beautiful combination of textures and color. Our next garden is in Germany, and it is made by Peter Yankee. He is a professional designer, and this is a garden that he made in the German town of Hilden. It's 4 acres in the middle of a city, and the street outside is like rushing traffic, but you get into the garden and it is a completely different world. It is elegant, it is stylish, and it is surrounded on one side by the street, but on the 3 other side by an urban forest. And the garden is called Hortus. This is the way you spell it in German. In the spring, that same scene that we just saw has a big lawn with a circular kind of shape and curving beds. And he has planted it with lots of spring bulbs. The Italian cypresses that you see in the background, and you see at the lower point, I just realized I'm sorry, I've had my cursor up there, but let me show you this. This is a boxwood hedge, and in between is the driveway, which is kind of a difficult thing to have a garden where you have a driveway right up the middle. But he has handled it well in that he has a lawn on one side And on the other side, he has a gravel garden. And then there's another quarter where he has a woodland garden. And then the fourth quarter, it has an herb garden and a place for selling plants, a nursery, and so on. He says that, he started out giving the garden a really strong structure with hedges and alleys and focal points, and basically using geometry to structure the garden. But he said, then he filled it with wildlife-friendly naturalistic plantings. And this is a combination you see a lot all over Europe. And he said to me, I love to see how these two different design ideas play together throughout the seasons. In the winter, my garden shows its formal bones very clearly, while dried grasses and seed heads catch the winter sun. In the summer, you can hardly see the formality of hedges, paths, clipped evergreens, and thousands of lush herbaceous plants and grasses create a softening layer. So let's just look at a few pictures. His lawn kind of devolves into a river of grass. He has a silver garden in which every plant in there has silver leaves. And this is the gravel garden, which, if some of you know Beth Chatto was one of the first garden makers to have a gravel garden. And she did it because her site had such poor soil, and she decided that would be an easier way of dealing with it. And he made a gravel garden just like hers in the driest, dustiest part of his property. And there is places throughout the garden where you can sit down and you can see how casually the plants are allowed to roam and kind of find their own place. The next garden is Bramafam, and it is in Italy, in northern Italy, above a town called Ravello. The designer is Paolo Pesroni. He is the best known landscape architect in Italy, although probably none of us in the United States have heard of him. And his story is so interesting to me because he started out being trained by Russell Page, which some of you may know, one of the great garden designers of the 20th century in England. And then he also did an apprenticeship with Roberto Burle Marx in Brazil, which some of you who know modern garden design, he is very well known. He was both men were great plantsmen, and Pesroni learned a tremendous amount to them, and then came back to Italy and started his practice. He's been practicing for nearly 50 years, and he's done hundreds and hundreds of public and private gardens throughout Europe and the Middle East. And despite all this, he says, "Don't call me an architect. I am above all a gardener." So Bramafam is his home. And that's his house, a very large Italian kind of villa. And he has 12 and a half acres on a very, very steep, sloped, part of it is a valley and part of it is going up the hills or semi-mountains. And so therefore he has made it a terraced garden. But if you're thinking of a terraced garden in the way that many of the famous Italian gardens are, this is not it. It's very naturalistic, although he used to shape plants and he uses hedges a lot. It's really, this garden is a plant lover's paradise. He has also, you could say, it's a collector's garden. He loves trees and shrubs. And so even though elsewhere in Europe you see gardens that are almost purely perennials, here you see shrubs and trees as the dynamic form in the garden. And you can tell his plants are quite overgrown. They would make some people very nervous. He told me the garden develops freely and is what we call esuberante. I can't speak Italian, so what it means is exuberant. And when I asked him if it was wild, he answered, I prefer to call it a messy place, natural but full of life, where weeds can be present, even if under control. Ornamental plants are free to grow lushly and are only guided with small interventions. I don't want a spick and span garden. So his love of trees and shrubs, he has gathered them from all over the world. He also has, so here is a tree that was there when he arrived. It's an old oak tree. And that is where he puts his places that he wants to share with people when they come to his garden, places to sit down. Or this is a dove tree. If you've never heard of it, it's not used very much in the United States, nor in Europe really, but it's a very special tree that has flowers that hang down a little bit like a dove's wings. So that's why it's called the dove tree. And you can see that he puts a bench there because it's a beautiful place to be when the tree is blooming. He also grows edibles, and he said to me that his vegetable garden is so important to him. It's something he works in every day. And he loves the fact that he can produce his own food. And he's been doing it since he was 4 years old. He feels as though having a vegetable garden for a child is like you're allowing them to get the skills, the manual skills that are necessary for gardening throughout their lives, because you can't learn it except for getting your hands in the dirt. He has off in the distance, he has what he considers his biggest triumph, which is a olive grove, and he produces olive oil from that. He has planted plants underneath the olive trees. And so at certain times of year, you'll see daffodils, and a little later, you'll see irises. He has a pond at the bottom, at the really bottom of this valley that he gardens. And he there collects he has a special love of magnolias. And so that's where he collects them. And it's a very shady place. And he has hydrangeas and azaleas and evergreen ferns. And there you see a bit more. Now we're moving on to gardens designed by their owners. And there is a category in, I'm going to have to rush. I'm going to go fast through this. There's a category of designers who are owners of their gardens that have no formal training. And yet, because they have grown up in a strong gardening culture, because their parents maybe were great gardeners, because they have visited many, many gardens, they are able to make their own gardens to a very, very high level. So let's first look at one in England. This is Pettifer's Garden, again in Oxfordshire. It is owned by Gina Price. She knew very little when she came to this house. She knew she wanted a garden, so she didn't know much about gardens, but she kind of did a very typical English garden. But gradually, as she visited gardens, she realized that she was really just following other people's kind of traditional ideas. And one day she decided she would just kind of pull out all of the roses pull out all of the shrubs that she was using, and she wanted to have a perennial grass garden that was a little bit more spontaneous. So this is what you see when you come into the garden. It's this a very intimate low garden with a lawn panel that has many perennials around it. She went to India at one point and came back with a love of clear, pure color. And so she started putting colors together that she wouldn't have thought of before. She's constantly trying to improve her garden. In the middle of her garden, she has a parterre, but it's not a parterre like the Italian garden or that boxwood parterre that we saw earlier at Broughton Grange with the softly shaped boxwoods. This is a parterre that has no discernible pattern. It's just what she likes to put in it. She does use these topiaries as kind of sentinels so that you know that you're going to go through them to go further into the garden. On either side, she has a meadow that earlier in the season is crocuses and daffodils and fritillary. And then she allows the grass to grow up and doesn't mow it until late in June. So this is when it's the meadow. Later, she mows it. She also, here's another example of the colors that she puts together. Very rich, very appealing. And this is her parterre in the autumn. And you can see that further down, there are some grasses and autumn, what she calls her autumn border, things that bloom later in the season. Definitely want to encourage you to, if you get to England, try to get to Pettifers if you can. The other garden that's made by the owners is Le Jardin Plume, and it's in Normandy. It's a garden that was made by Patrick and Sylvie Quibble, highly skilled gardeners who visited many, many gardens over the year and learned about garden design. They have taken the idea of a French formal garden, straight lines with a formal grid, and turned it into a formal grid with perennials and grasses. So it's a naturalistic garden verging on wild. Some parts of it are definitely wild. And I'll just quickly go through this. One of the things that is the most photographic in all of Europe is this hedge. They started this hedge when they first were making the garden, not knowing that it was going to be as playful as it is, or as, turn into what everyone calls the wave hedge. But it took them 15 years, and gradually they shaped it into this. So surrounding it are all of these wild grasses, but here is this formal element made modern with a modern twist. This hedge that is not like any other hedge. Maybe you've seen it. It's great fun. This is a complicated garden. It's not an easy garden to understand. It takes a number of visits, and it also takes some thought to understand it, but I recommend it highly. And then our final garden is Broadwoodside in Scotland. Another couple that made a garden, Robert and Anna Dalrymple. It is about a half hour outside of Edinburgh. And they bought a dilapidated, falling apart farmstead, and over a couple of years, renovated it and turned it into a series of buildings that were connected, and 2 courtyards within. And that's the heart of the garden, these 2 courtyards, maybe this one right here. So they made a plan, and the plan for this part of the garden had 25 squares. Each square had a different kind of material in it, or some were repeated. but basically a different kind of material. They wanted something that would be good to look at in the wintertime. They said, you know, Scotland has such terrible, cold, dreary winters. And so they wanted to make sure it was evergreen. In the middle of each one of the planted squares is a tree. It's an acer, a maple, which has on it, and I don't have a picture of it, but it has a label on that identifies it as something else. It's not the correct plant. And so that starts you thinking something's going on here. And there is a kind of wittiness to this garden that you see the further you get into it. The other side of the courtyard, that the courtyard that we just saw, that was, and I'm like, just a minute. Oh, Robert. I couldn't think of his name for a second. Robert was the one that designed that. He is all about symmetry. He is all about geometry. He is a book designer. Does books for museums and art shows and things like that. Very high-toned kind of materials. And so I think that garden with the squares really shows his skills. This side of the garden is Anna's garden, and she has made it much more casual, much softer. And you can tell in this close-up of the plants that she used, it's again a little bit more naturalistic. Then when you leave the main part of the garden and go out into the further reaches of the garden, you go through this very strong red gate. And this is where they have put a lot of their found objects and turned them into garden objects. So you could call it garden art if you want. So this was on the steeple of a church originally, which they found. This is called a load of balls. These were balls that they collected from all over. I don't know where all they got them, but anyway, it's part of their kind of bringing. They have a very creative spirit about what they bring into their garden. And then finally, they in the lane coming up to the garden, they put up a speed bump sign and then decided to make it into anagrams of speed bump, 3 more signs, and it ends up dumb peeps, embed pups, beep dumps. So I hope that this has been for you an enjoyable kind of tour through what the gardens are like in Europe. And I hope that it will make you feel as though you would like to travel when we get through with this pandemic stuff. And that you'll be inspired by these very personal gardens that are being made in Europe today. If you choose your itinerary well, you can immerse yourself in atmospheric, plant-rich environments. And at the end of it, I think you'll have a sense of what the spirit is of garden making in Europe today. As you know, I have a garden tour company. And so you can use the book, my book, as a guide for to the gardens that you can go through. In the back, there's an index which gives you the way to get in touch with the garden owners to see if you can visit. If you want to go as a group, these are the tours that I have planned for this year. 2 go to England, 1 in May, 1 in July. In August, we go to the Netherlands, and in September to France. Thank you so much for your attention. If you want to get in touch with me, you can pretty much just say Carolyn Mullet and in Google, and you'll find my various endeavors. And now I'm ready for some questions.
Carolyn, thank you so much for sharing these extraordinarily beautiful places with us this evening. We have a lot of fabulous questions coming in from our audience already. Definitely time for more though, so please feel free to add your questions using that Q&A module, which will appear at either the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your device. We have a couple of questions, Carolyn, asking about where all of these gardens, where we can find more. And you mentioned just now that they are all in your book. I dropped the link to order that from Hillwood's Museum Shop into the chat. And Pam asked if you can tell us which gardens are open to the public, how we can come explore these spaces with you.
Well, my book has 50 gardens, so I don't have a list that tells you which are open. They're all open to the public at some point in each year. I would recommend looking at the gardens in the book and deciding which ones you're interested in. Or if you're going to Spain, then look at the gardens in the Spain chapter, or Scotland the same way, Ireland, Germany, the Netherlands, and then go to the back of the book, and there you will find the websites listed, and you can then find out their phone numbers and call them.
Fantastic. And I looked up, I can't remember which one, but at some point I was Googling while listening and admiring your photographs, and there were a couple of that list general seasons and hours, as well as the fact that you might be able to make private arrangements with their owners at other times of years, which is lovely. We have, not surprisingly, a couple of questions about that extraordinary wave hedge. Do you know a little bit more about how that's shaped, whether, there were questions about what sort of upkeep it requires? I know you said it took 15 years.
It took 15 years for it to get to the peak of the waves, yes. It's something that you start out with. I mean, a hedge, in Europe, this is the way they do it. We don't do it, most of the time, I don't see people doing that in the United States. They start out with very small plants, maybe a foot tall, maybe 18 inches tall, space them maybe a foot apart, at the most 18 inches, but usually about a foot apart, 18 inches. And then as they grow, they start shearing the sides and then start making the shape that they want the top to be. And that shape was something that they didn't start out to make, but it ended up, I guess, just through some quirks of the years that they were shaping it, they started seeing that they could make it into this really incredible shape, and they just kept working on it. I have seen pictures of when it was about 2/3 done, and you would see some areas, the dips were very clean, and then there were little
spurts
at the top. And so it just takes something that you are willing to work on for years. And it doesn't have to be done that often. I think that they actually shape it twice a year.
It strikes me as surprisingly little upkeep now that it is trained and just so whimsical. I love that. And it caught a lot of attention from our visitors. A couple of folks asked about boxwoods, those hedges, and whether Europe is suffering from the same boxwood diseases and blights that we are experiencing here in our area.
Yes, it's been really a problem. There have been some formal gardens that have pulled out every boxwood and replaced it with various substitutes that they have found. Yes, they're having the same problem. Boxwood blight, and then there's another disease that has come in the last few years. Some gardens are pulling them out and replacing them with substitutes. Other gardens are like allowing them to have more air, and they're very careful about cleaning their tools, disinfecting their tools, and so on. It's a variety of ways. Because of the last 2 years, I haven't been in Europe, so I don't know exactly what's happening now. But when I started my company and I started doing tours from the beginning, that was a concern. And gradually I saw people taking actions against to keep the important kind of features of their garden as well as they might be able to. It is a deep concern. I would say in the United States, there's actually one nursery in the DC area. It's Saunders Nursery. It's somewhere in Virginia. And they have come up with a boxwood that they feel is a good substitute for English boxwood, and that does not have the problems. So that's one place to go.
Excellent. Vanessa asked a little bit, I think, along those same lines about the maintenance and upkeep. For most of these places, do the owners have gardeners who help with the upkeep, or do they do a lot of the work themselves, or a combination, just as we saw with the design?
It is most of the time a combination, but there is definitely a whole important, let's say, professional gardeners in Europe that we don't have as many of here. Now, we have professional gardeners in public gardens, but there aren't so many that do private gardens. But we tend to use landscapers, and I think sometimes, I don't want to offend anyone, but the truth is sometimes they don't do a very good job of understanding. They do things that make it quick and fast, but they don't understand plants that well. In Europe, there are people that are trained in various universities and in trade schools and in public gardens like Kew and the the Royal Horticultural Society. All of those places are places that people are trained. And some of the gardens have like someone 1 day a week that comes, and they do the rest of the gardening. Others have like one gardener that may actually work for them full time. Other gardens have like a crew, like maybe 3 or 4. You never hear of a private garden these days, or I haven't heard of them, having more than 3 or 4. It's just too expensive. And so the gardens they create are going to be able to be managed by the amount of labor that they have available.
That makes perfect sense and is a really interesting perspective, both on the training of gardeners, as well as you singled out a lot of more naturalistic gardens, which I think goes hand in hand with some of that upkeep.
Mm-hmm.
Teresa asked about the England has a national trust for gardens, and that is one source to find some of these extraordinary gardens for public weekends and things like that. Is there a comparable list or agency throughout the rest of Europe? Is it country by country, or is it really just England that has that sort of a structure?
Well, all the UK countries have something called the National Garden Scheme. And it is private gardens that open for charity. In other words, they charge for people to come into their gardens, and then they donate the money to a charity. And I don't really know. I think each one decides where the money is going to go. But it's a huge thing. I mean, every weekend during the summer, you will have gardens open. So that is, and I want to point out that the National Trust, you're going to see a different kind of garden. It's going to be, the National Trust is also, it's also has financial issues. And so they have to make the gardens that they own and take care of be able to be cared for by the number of gardeners they can afford. And so that means that they aren't always as well taken care of as they could be. Sometimes they are wonderfully taken care of, but other times they aren't. But the private gardens that you can see would be through the NGS, and people go to great lengths to make them wonderful for their visitors for the weekends that they are open. So a garden may be open 6 times during the summer, 6 weekends in the summer, a large garden, or maybe it'll just be open once. Now, the gardens that I'm showing you here, some of them would be part of the National Trust, others are not. They are independent. These are, gardens, some of which they allow their gardens to be visited because it helps pay for the care of the gardens. So they're very happy to have tour groups come. They will sometimes open for individuals if you, ask in a nice way and are polite, and they will open it for you if they're home. But they are not in general going to be like on a list somewhere.
Alyssa asked about how these, you singled out towards the beginning that these are some of the best and most extraordinary private gardens, and contrasting private gardens with public gardens like Hillwood. And Alyssa asked if there was anything you could speak to in terms of why these gardens are so prominent and the type of design work that goes into these extraordinary private gardens.
I'm a little unclear as to what the question is. Could you rephrase it?
Yes, let me try my best. And I apologize to both Carolyn and Alyssa if I am butchering this question as I try to
it's fine.
To mush it around. But Alyssa, I think, was asking about the historical benchmarks of why today's private gardens are so striking and so prominent.
Okay. Well, I think what it is, it's like in the zeitgeist. It's just something that's happening. It happened before. In the early 20th century, when Sissinghurst, Hidcote, Kifsgate, I'm trying to think of all the other gardens that were made at that time, Great Dixter, all of those gardens were being made at one time. And you say, why did this all happen in a 25, 30-year period? It's hard to say, except that something kind of gets it going, and people love expressing themselves through their gardens. And that's the period that we're in. I can't say exactly why, but it certainly is something that you feel when you see over a period of time, many gardens, you're kind of very aware, this is a special time. These are not people that are sitting back and doing something easy. They are so in love with plants. They are so in love with garden design that they put themselves out. They stretch themselves to make the best garden they possibly can. And we are fortunate because then we can see them.
I love that. I will pose just one final question for you, and I was going to say it might be kind of a softball, but it might be asking you which of your children is your favorite. Rick asked which garden in this book is your favorite, and why it is that resonates so much with you.
Oh my, I can't, I don't know how to answer that. I'll tell you, let me answer just a slightly different question. Which is, which garden do I think expresses our time and has done it the best? I can answer that. And I think it's Jardin Plume, the French garden. They are such great plants people. they know so much, and they do it so well. And after you visit that garden, both in the design and in the plants, you really feel like you've been given a window into all the different threads that are happening in the garden world today, and they have pulled it together. It's a remarkable garden. When I first went, though, I want to say I came away from it just kind of going, "Oh, I don't know. What have I seen? What you know?" It was complicated, and it took me thinking about it for 2 or 3 months afterwards to kind of start pulling it together. I read some things also, and so I think sometimes there are gardens that are just so beautiful that your heart just sings, and there are other gardens that are so interesting because of the individual kind of impact or the individual creativity that has been put into it. But Plume is one of these gardens that pulls it all together. It's all about the environment. It's about the location. It's about the special place that it has. It's about the history that it has. All of those things come together, and they've just done it with a real panache. It's a very special garden. So that's what I think about that. But I love them all, you know?
Well,
really
I do too. I am so glad that you shared them with us this evening and that there are more to discover in the book. I want to thank all of our guests who have joined us this evening. This has been a really lovely way. We had our first hint of almost spring again here in DC today, and I am looking forward to embracing the rest of it with beautiful gardens like these. I hope that everyone will join us next week for the third program in our Great Homes and Gardens series. Next week, we'll be talking about the architecture of Marion Sims Wyeth with Jane S. Day. Carolyn, this has been an absolute delight.
My honor, really. Thank you.
Have a great night, everyone.